Have we done 3 before? We've done 2 a couple times. Hey everyone, Sarah Nova. This time around, we are talking about a very cool Ducati. This one is definitely a survivor, if you this particular example. And what it is a 1975 Ducati 860 GT. So this particular model, this particular era, um, was sort of the beginning of the Ducati L Twin or V Twin, um, and called an L Twin by some because it's a 90-degree V twin, and that makes an L. So it's prior to this time, Ducati had been known for making single-cylinder bikes, all fairly sporty. And they had 250s, they had 175, 250s. Heck, they had a 125, they had 150. The 250s and 350s were the sort of the hot stuff, at least in the United States, because those were bigger. Uh, at least big enough for their time. And they used, sometimes they used regular valve springs, and sometimes they used the Desmo valve spring setup, which Ducati became famous for and is still sort of famous for using. For those who don't know, the Desmo valve train is when you have a mechanical opening and closing of the valve. So you have 2 rockers, basically, one that opens and one that closes. Whereas in a traditional setup, you have one that opens and you have a spring that pushes it back to close it. Now, that being said, the GT was not a super sport bike. It was a touring bike, and this has traditional valve springs to it. But other than that, very similar to the Desmo headed machines that they also made. So by the time the twins came out, Ducati was famous for peppy, interesting singles and bikes that honestly kind of punched above their weight. They were quick, they were light, they were agile, and overall very fast, successful in club racing. And the Desmo gave them a cachet of exotica, which was kind of cool. So early 70s come around, and they came out with the 750 twin, which was a hit right off the bat for racing. Imola came out and they dominated that race and really blew away people who didn't know they could make a big bike, and the rest is history. Now, when you think about Ducati, you don't think about singles, you think about stuff like the Panigale, and other V twins, and now they're into V4s with the MotoGP bikes and things like that. But they really are known for the V twin, and they're still making it to this day. They've made this motor essentially the same architecture, updated continually. And now these things are making 200 plus horsepower. So that's a little bit of the history. This is the beginning. This is the second iteration of the first generation of the Ducati V Twin. The 860 GT came out after the 750 GT, so it's just a little bit of an update, bigger motor. These were touring bikes. They were long, they were sleek, they could ride all day. They're geared tall, so you can really get on here and cruise at 80 miles an hour all day long. And they're very unique. They're in sort of like a BMW Airhead. When you're on one, they feel like nothing else. They are interesting and unique bikes, so kind of cool. General stuff about it, the motor, we just talked about it. You have top shelf Ceriani forks, top of the line for their time. Brembo brakes. You got the drilled discs, which was pretty high tech in those days. Flanged alloy rims, Baranis, of course. So you got the best Italian kit of its time. And then La Franconi pipes, although the big hot setup for these back in the day was to put a set of Conti pipes on them, which sound even better than these do. Marzocchi rear shocks, those are okay. Yeah, that's about it. The frame, they have not gotten into the trellis frame yet. If you know Ducatis, you know that in the 80s they started developing their trellis frame, which they still use versions of to this day. So this is a much more standard cradle frame, much more of the 70s kind of stuff. Not that exotic, when it comes down to that. So yeah, this is a bike that came to us. It was the owner who brought it to us. I believe it was their father's bike, and he inherited it or got it into his hands. And he said, "Hey, can you make this something I can ride again?" And we took most of this bike and boxes of parts, and we said, "Yeah, we can do that." So it was a weird project in that there was some things that were very difficult. Like the wiring was trash. Somebody had done a lot of rebuilding of things over the years, and there was just nothing left to work with. And you can't buy a harness for these anymore. So we made our own wiring harness. But thankfully, the motor was in great shape. There's a little bit of oil weeping and stuff like that, but the spec of this one is not to fix stuff like that, just to make sure it's okay enough to ride around and have a good time on. The motor was generally good. Carbs took a clean. They said the wiring harness, the brakes we've redone. This is a rebuilt master cylinder, and we've upgraded to stainless lines because the originals were gone. That's always a nice upgrade to do, especially if you can do it in black so it doesn't look glaringly out of place on a vintage bike. And then electrical stuff, we actually are using some replica Lucas blinkers on there, which is sacrilege, I know, to the Italophiles out there. But you can get a really, really good. These are very close to what the look of the originals were, and far, far, far cheaper. What's cool about a bike like this is there's a decent amount of aftermarket support out there for it. You can't get everything. You can't get a wiring harness, and in past times we've had to wait 2 years for a brake rotor on somebody else's bike. But there are people that are supplying what's out there and making stuff. The bracket that holds the blinkers, for example, that's a replica of OEM. That came from the UK, and it's not cheap. Nothing on this bike is cheap, but it's cool to know that you can get it, and having that bracket in there looks just a lot better than making up something out of flat stock that would be obviously homemade. So it makes the non-correct blinkers just look a little bit more in place. Other weird things when you get somebody's bike that was their dad's or something like that, you find weird stuff like, what the heck are these highway bars doing here? I've tried riding this bike around. There's no way my feet can get up there and do anything remotely approaching comfort. But sometimes you find something like this and you realize, like, oh, that was so they could put their kid in the gas tank or something like that. There's stories in these things that go way back, and only the people who were there and owned them know them. So lastly, we threw on some Hide Now tires. We're loving these things. These are sort of a vintage pattern with a modern compound on it, and they work great. I've been racing on a set of a set of Hide Now race tires, which are similar but have the race compound in them, and I'm loving those things. So those are pretty cool. If you don't know Hide Now tires, check them out. They are rapidly taking the place of Avon in the vintage market. I was always an Avon fan, but they are slowly but surely disappearing from the market, which is sad, but that's what happens. So yeah, if you have any familiarity with these things, please let us know about it. It's kind of cool to line these up with what was else happening in the mid 70s. You could put this next to a Kawasaki Z1, for example, which if you watch us, we've had one in the shop. Put it next to a Moto Guzzi Le Mans one. Laverda Jota, that kind of thing, and even Honda CB750. Like, what was happening in the mid 70s in the superbike world, this fits right into it. Even though it's a touring bike, a lot of the superbikes were actually touring bikes that just went really darn fast. So this one fits the bill for that. It's not a super sport race replica, but it's a standard machine that would go over 100 miles an hour quite easily. So yeah, and what's funny too is we have here a much more modern Ducati Multistrada, and same V-twin engine, or same, obviously not the same engine, but the same basic layout. And it's funny because this is what a touring bike has become. The ADV thing, the long travel suspension, the ability to go on any road you can find. This has really taken over the touring market. Obviously, the Bagger, the Harley world, the cruisers, that kind of touring bike is still there. And the Goldwing world is still there. But those are very large, and it's a very particular highway kind of cruising bike. But this kind of machine that you could take down a highway but also take down a dirt road has become this kind of bike, and I think that's kind of interesting. These aren't my cup of tea, but I think it's just kind of cool to see how the market changes and what the trends are and where they go. And Ducati going strong, making V-twin touring bikes. So if you're a fan of Ducatis, please let us know what's your favorite. If you've had a bunch of them, I love it when you tell us what you've had, because the arc of people's bike ownership, why they get something and what they end up with, is always interesting and fascinating to me, because I've had my own arc of things. And yeah, and if you hate them, let us know why. I love that stuff too. So as usual, thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. It always helps us. And yeah, take care.